Chapter 2. He woke with the dawn, little rested. All night he had dreamed of strange places and beings that filled him with beauty and wonder and dread. Of swimming in the ocean's depths, and up the Miskatonic among fish and amphibia and strange men, half batrachian in aspect, of monstrous entities that lay sleeping in an eerie stone city at the bottom of the sea, of utterly outre music as of flutes, accompanied by weird ululations from throats far, far from human, of Grandfather Luther Whateley standing accusingly before him and thundering forth his wrath at him for having dared to enter Aunt Sarey's shuttered room. He was troubled, but he shrugged his unease away before the necessity of walking into Dunwich for the provisions he had neglected to bring with him in his haste. The morning was bright and sunny. Pewees and thrushes sang, and dew purled on leaf and blade reflected the sunlight in 1,000 jewels among the winding path that led to the main street of the village. As he went along, his spirits rose. He whistled happily, and contemplated the early fulfillment of his obligation, on which his escape from this desolate, forgotten pocket of ingrown humanity was predicated. But the main street of Dunwich was no more reassuring under the light of the sun than it had been in the dusk of the past evening. The village huddled between the Miskatonic and the almost vertical slope of Round Mountain, a dark and brooding settlement which seemed somehow never to have passed 1900, as if time had ground to a stop before the turn of the last century. He averted his eyes from the buildings falling into ruin. He avoided the curiously expressionless faces of passers-by and went directly to the old church with its general store, which he knew he would find slovenly and ill-kept, in keeping with the village itself. A gaunt-faced storekeeper watched his advance down the aisle, searching his features for any familiar lineament. Abner strode up to him and asked for bacon, coffee, eggs, and milk. The storekeeper peered at him. He made no move.
"Ye'll be a Whateley,"
he said at last.
"I don't expect ye know me. I'm your cousin Tobias. Which one of 'em are ye?"
"I'm Abner, Luther's grandson," he spoke reluctantly. Tobias Whateley's face froze.
"Libby's boy, Libby, that married cousin Jeremiah. You folks ain't back at Luther's? You folks ain't a-goin' to start things again?"
"There's no one but me," said Abner shortly. "What things are you talking about?"
"If you don't know, 'tain't for me to say."
Nor would Tobias Whateley speak again. He put together what Abner wanted, took his money sullenly, and watched him out of the store with ill-concealed animosity. Abner was disagreeably affected. The brightness of the morning had dimmed for him, though the sun shone from the same unclouded heaven. He hastened away from the store in Main Street and hurried along the lane towards the house he had but recently quitted. He was even more disturbed to discover, standing before the house, an ancient rig drawn by an old workhorse. Beside it stood a boy, and inside it sat an old, white-bearded man, who, at sight of Abner's approach, signaled to the boy for assistance, and by the lad's aid, laboriously descended to the ground and stood to await Abner. As Abner came up, the young boy spoke, unsmiling. "Great-grandpa'll talk to you." "Abner," said the old man quaveringly, and Abner saw for the first time how very old he was. "This here's great-grandpa Zebulon Whateley," said the boy. "Grandfather Luther Whateley's brother, the only living Whateley of his generation." "Come in, sir," said Abner, offering the old man his arm. Zebulon Whateley took it. The three of them made slow progress towards the veranda, where the old man halted at the foot of the steps, turning his dark eyes upon Abner from under their bushy white brows and shaking his head gently.
"Now, if you'll fetch me a cheer, I'll set."
Bring a chair from the kitchen, boy, said Abner. The boy sped up the steps and into the house. He was out as fast with a chair for the old man, and helped to lower him to it, and stood beside him while Zebulon Whateley caught his breath. Presently he turned his eyes full upon Abner and contemplated him, taking in every detail of his clothes, which, unlike his own, were not made by hand. "Why have you come, Abner?" he asked, his voice firmer now. Abner told him, as simply and directly as he could. Zebulon Whateley shook his head. "Ye know more'n the rest, and less'n some," he said. "What Luther was about, only God knowed. Now Luther's gone, and you'll have it to do. I can tell ye, Abner, I vow afore God, I don't know why Luther took on so and lock hisself up, and Sarey that time she come back Innsmouth, but I can say it was something terrible, and the things that happened was terrible. Ain't nobody left to say Luther was to blame, nor poor Sarey. But take care, Abner." "I expect to follow my grandfather's wishes," said Abner. The old man nodded, but his eyes were troubled, and it was plain that he had little faith in Abner. "How'd you find out I was here, Uncle Zebulon?" Abner asked. "I had the word ye'd come. It was my bounden duty to talk to ye. The Whateleys has a curse on 'em. Thar's been them now gone to ground has had to do with the devil, and thar's some what whistled terrible things out o' the air, and thar's some what had to do with things that wasn't all human nor all fish, but lived in the water and swum out, way out to sea, and thar's some what growed in on themselves and got all mazed and queer, and that's what happened on Sentinel Hill that time, Lavinia's Wilbur, and that other one by the Sentinel Stone. God, I shake when I think on it." "Now, Grandpa, don't ye get your dander up," chided the boy. I won't, said the old man tremulously. "It's all died away now. It's forgot. By all but me and them what took the signs down. The signs that pointed to Dunwich, saying it was too terrible a place to know about." He shook his head and was silent. "Uncle Zebulon," said Abner, "I never saw my Aunt Sarah." No, boy. She was locked up that time. Before you were born, I think it was." "Why?" "Only Luther knowed. And God. Now Luther's gone, and God don't seem like he knowed Dunwich was still here." "What was Aunt Sarah doing in Innsmouth?" "Visiting kin." "Are the Whateleys there, too?" "Not Whateleys. Marshes. Old Obed Marsh, that was Pa's cousin. Him and his wife that he found in the trade, at Ponep, if you know where that is." "I do." "You do? I never knowed. They say Sarey was visiting Marsh kin, Obed's son or grandson, I never knowed which, never heard, don't care. She was thar quite a spell. They say when she come back she was different, flighty, unsettled, sassed her pa. And then, not long after, he locked her up in that room till she died." "How long after?" 3-4 months. And Luther never said what fur. Nobody saw her again after until the day she was laid out in her coffin. 2 year, might be 3 year ago. Thar was that time nigh on to a year after she came back from Innsmouth. Thar was such goings on here at this house, a fightin' and a screamin' and a screechin'. Most everyone in Dunwich heard it, but no one went to see what it was. And next day Luther, he said it was only Sarey took with a spell. Might be it was something else." "What else, Uncle Zebulon?"
"Devil's work," said the old man instantly. "But I forget. You're the educated one. Ain't many Whateleys ever been educated. Thar was Lavinia, she read them terrible books what was no good for her, and Sarey, she read some. Them as has only a little learning might's well have none. They ain't fit to handle life with only a little learning. They're fitter with none at all. Abner smiled. Don't ye laugh, boy.
I'm not laughing, Uncle Zebulon. I agree with you.
Then if you come face to face with it, you'll know what to do. You won't stop and think. You'll just do.
With what?
I wished I knowed, Abner. I don't. God knows. Luther knowed. Luther's dead. It comes on me Sarey knowed, too. Sarey's dead. Now nobody knows what terrible thing it was. If I was a praying man, I'd pray you don't find out. But if you do, don't stop to figure it out by education. Just do what you have to do. Your grandpa kept a record. Might look for it. You might learn what kind of people the Marshes was. They wasn't like us. Something terrible happened to 'em. And might be it reached out and touched Sarey.
Something stood between the old man and Abner Whateley. Something unvoiced, perhaps unknown. But it was something that cast a chill about Abner, for all his conscious attempt to belittle what he felt. I'll learn what I can, Uncle Zebulon, he promised. The old man nodded and beckoned to the boy. He signified that he wished to rise, to return to the buggy. The boy came running.
If you need me, Abner, send word to Tobias, said Zebulon Whateley. I'll come, if I can.
Thank you. Abner and the boy helped the old man back into the buggy. Zebulon Whateley raised his forearm in a gesture of farewell. The boy whipped up the horse, and the buggy drew away. Abner stood for a moment looking after the departing vehicle. He was both troubled and irritated, troubled at the suggestion of something dreadful which lurked beyond Zebulon Whateley's words of warning, irritated because his grandfather, despite all his adjurations, had left him so little to act upon. Yet this must have been because his grandfather evidently believed there might have been nothing untoward to greet his grandson when at last Abner Whateley arrived at the old house. It could be nothing other than by way of explanation. Yet Abner was not entirely convinced. Was the matter one of such horror that Abner should not know of it unless he had to? Or had Luther Whateley laid down such a key to the riddle elsewhere in the house? He doubted it. It would not be grandfather's way to seek the devious, when he had always been so blunt and direct. He went into the house with his groceries, put them away, and sat down to map out a plan of action. The very first thing to be accomplished was a survey of the mill part of the structure, to determine whether any machinery could be salvaged. Next, he must find someone who would undertake to tear down the mill and the room above it. Therefore he must dispose of the house and adjoining property, though he had a sinking feeling of futility at the conviction that he would never find anyone who would want to settle in so forlorn a corner of Massachusetts as Dunwich. He began at once to carry out his obligations. His search of the mill, however, disclosed that the machinery which had been in it, save for such pieces as were fixed to the running of the wheel, had been removed and presumably sold. Perhaps this increment from the sale was part of that very legacy Luther Whateley had deposited in the bank at Arkham for his grandson. Abner was thus spared the necessity of removing the machinery before beginning the planned demolition. The dust in the old mill almost suffocated him. It lay an inch thick over everything, and it rose in great gusts to cloud about him when he walked through the empty, cobwebbed rooms. Dust muffled his footsteps, and he was glad to leave the mill to go around and look at the wheel. He worked his way around the wooden ledge to the frame of the wheel, somewhat uncertain, lest the wood give way and plunge him into the water beneath. But the construction was firm. The wood did not give, and he was soon at the wheel. It appeared to be a splendid example of middle 19th century work. It would be a shame to tear it apart, thought Abner. Perhaps the wheel could be removed, and a place could be found for it, either in some museum, or in one of those buildings which were forever being reconstructed by wealthy persons interested in the preservation of the American heritage. He was about to turn away from the wheel, when his eye was caught by a series of small wet prints on the paddles. He bent closer to examine them, but, apart from ascertaining that they were already in part dried, he could not see in them more than marks left by some small animal, probably batrachian, a frog or a toad, which had apparently mounted the wheel in the early hours before the rising of the sun. His eyes, raising, followed the line of the wheel to the broken-out shutters of the room above. He stood for a moment, thinking. He recalled the batrachian creature he had glimpsed along the baseboard of the shuttered room. Perhaps it had escaped through the broken pane? Or, more likely, perhaps another of its kind had discovered its presence and gone up to it. A faint apprehension stirred in him, but he brushed it away in irritation that a man of his intelligence should have been sufficiently stirred by the aura of ignorant, superstitious mystery clinging to his grandfather's memory to respond to it. Nevertheless, he went around and mounted the stairs to the shuttered room. He half expected, when he unlocked the door, to find some significant change in the aspect of the room as he remembered it from last night. But, apart from the unaccustomed daylight streaming into the room, there was no alteration. He crossed to the window. There were prints on the sill. There were 2 sets of them. One appeared to be leading out, the other entering. They were not the same size. The prints leading outward were tiny, only half an inch across. Those leading in were double that size. Abner bent close and stared at them in fixed fascination. He was not a zoologist, but he was by no means ignorant of zoology. The prints on the sill were like nothing he had ever seen before, not even in dream. Save for being, or seeming to be, webbed, they were the perfect prints in miniature of human hands and feet. Though he made a cursory search for the creature, he saw no sign of it, and finally, somewhat shaken, he retreated from the room and locked the door behind him, already regretting the impulse which had led him to it in the first place, and which had caused him to burst open the shutters which for so long had walled the room away from the outer world.